Hello, church. It's good to see you again. It's time for our Wednesday night Bible study. We're going to continue our study on King David, and it's going to be running from chapter 15 on through chapter 19. I hope you've had a chance to look at that already. If not, that's what the pause switch is for on your computer or on your phone. But at any rate, we're going to be talking about David being a king on the run. Now, David, as he has to leave Jerusalem very quickly, has to decide what he can and what he cannot take with him. And because he's having to leave so quickly, he leaves behind 10 concubines. He places them in charge of the house to take care of it while he's gone. On the way, leaving Jerusalem, he is met by Ittai the Gittite. Now, this is a man who came to be friends with David when David was hiding amongst the Philistine nation. And although they've known each other for relatively a short amount of time, Ittai wants to follow David, and David cannot convince him otherwise. So Ittai and 600 of his men join forces with David and his men. David's next going to meet Zadok the priest and Abiathar. They are both Levites, and they bring with them the Ark of the Covenant. Now, David convinces them that he doesn't need the Ark of the Covenant to feel God's presence or know that God's with him or not, and tells them to return the Ark to Jerusalem, and makes a comment that if God is willing and God is approving of him, God will bring David back to Jerusalem, and he will once again be united with the Ark. He's going to ask Zadok and Abiathar to use their sons as messengers to keep him informed of what's going on in Jerusalem, particularly what's happening and what they hear from Absalom. David then discovers that Ahithophel, who is a very, very wise counselor, has joined forces with Absalom. Now, Ahithophel is one of those that shows such great wisdom and knowledge that he was highly valued by David and Absalom. And when David heard about this, he immediately prayed to God that God would find a way to thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. Soon after his prayer, David meets Hushai the Archite. Now, Hushai's also a counselor, a very wise man, and he wants to follow with David, but David convinces him that he would be more of a burden than a help, and that he could be a greater help if he were to go back and act like he's pledging allegiance to Absalom, and let David know what's going on in the inner parts of the decision making in Absalom's house. So he is supposed to report to the sons of Zadok and Abiathar, and then they will relay information to David from Absalom's house. Going into chapter 16, David's next going to meet Ziba. Now, Ziba was a servant of Saul. And you might remember that when Mephibosheth was invited to David's home, Ziba's the one who told David about his existence. And David tells Ziba that he and his sons are to work the property that belongs to Mephibosheth and to give him the profit. But Mephibosheth's going to live with David. He's going to eat from David's table and in his house. Well, Ziba meets with David, and David wonders, he says, "Where's your master?" And as Ziba is giving some assistance he had brought on some donkeys to David and his men, Ziba tells him that when word came that Absalom had taken over and that Absalom had run David out of the nation's capital, that Mephibosheth said, "Oh, now God's going to restore to me my father's kingdom." And hearing that, David was pretty angry. He didn't say much, but he did tell Ziba, "Everything that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." And Ziba answers in a kind of a humble way, "Whatever you say, your servant is your servant, and I will do whatever you want me to." Next, David's going to meet Shimei. Now, Shimei belongs to the house of Saul, although he's not in line to have become king. And he follows along David and his caravan of people as they're leaving Jerusalem, and he shouts curses at David. And he throws rocks at David and David's men. He tells David, "You're a man of bloodshed. you're getting just what comes to you. You know, God's going to take care of you for all the evil you did. You didn't belong to the throne. It didn't belong to you. Uh, you're usurping a position you didn't deserve, shouting all sorts of things. And one of David's men wants to go and kill Shimei. Abishai said, "Why should this dead dog curse the king?" And David says, "Listen, my own son is wanting to take my life. And what if this man has been told by God to curse? But at any rate, leave him alone. Perhaps God will look upon me at this time and will acquit me good instead of the evil that he is asking to bring upon me." So David refuses to take revenge for this insult. The scene in chapter 16 is now going to shift to Absalom. Hushai comes into the scene with Ahithophel is with Absalom, and Absalom is a little bit suspicious that Hushai would show up. He expected him to go to David, not knowing that he already had tried. So when he questioned Hushai and his loyalty, Hushai said, "No, my king. I'm going to be loyal to whoever God and the people have placed on the throne, and as I have served your father, so I will serve you." Absalom is satisfied with this answer. He then asks Ahithophel what the next move ought to be. Ahithophel, being the shrewd person that he is, knows that what Absalom needs to do next to solidify his power is to do something that would let the people know that he and his father are not ever going to be reconciled. So Ahithophel knows about the 10 concubines. In the Mideast terms, they would be called a harem because they were devoted only to one person. In this case, it was David the king. So he tells Absalom, "You should go into your father's concubines in the sight of all Israel." And Absalom realizes what effect this is going to have. It's going to let the people know that he has turned down a path and he's not going to turn back, and they can follow him knowing he's not going to double cross them in any way or form. So he does this, and the people realize just exactly how deep this rift is between Absalom and with his father David. The next advice he gives to Absalom is equally good, and from a military point of view, it was exactly what Absalom needed to do. Ahithophel asked for 12,000 men to be placed under his command, and he would take them out quickly and pursue after David. He said, "We will catch him when he is unawares, and when he's weary, we'll fall upon him. We will kill David, and David only will bring the men back to you." And in this way, it would minimize the amount of killing. It would maximize the chances that Absalom would have of unifying the kingdom. And he was exactly right. David and his men were weary. David is a much older man now than he was when he first began fighting wars. And Absalom is pleased with his advice. But since he's got Hushai there, he calls Hushai in and he tells him, "Here's what Ahithophel said." Apparently he sends Ahithophel away at this time. He said, "Here's what he told me, and what do you say?" Hushai said, "Well, this time the counsel of Ahithophel is not good." He then progresses to tell Absalom some things about David. He said, "You know your father. He's like a bear robbed of her cub. You know your father. He's a man of warfare. He knows what he should and shouldn't do. He's not going to spend the night with the people. He's going to be hiding up somewhere in a stronghold. And when your men go in under Ahithophel and they try to fall upon him and his men, they're going to be ambushed. There's going to be a slaughter among your men. The word's going to get out. Everyone's going to lose heart. You're going to lose your followers. So what you need to do, you need to go to all the kingdom. You need to gather a great, huge army from the north to the south, and you need to go lead them yourself and fall upon your father David, kill him and all those that are with him. If he flees into a city, take some ropes and drag the city into the sea. And in doing this, Hushai is appealing to Absalom's vanity as well as his fear. You know, most of the time that when a person is vain, and Absalom was a vain man, he cut his hair once a year, made a big deal of it, even weighed his hair because it grew so fast and he had so much. He must have just loved those long locks of hair. But at any rate, most vain people are also very insecure people. Some of the people you would think least likely to want to have something like plastic surgery are the people we already think are beautiful people, the actors and actresses and models, and yet they're the ones most likely to seek that kind of surgery because they're insecure about their looks. Even though they are vain about their looks, they're insecure. And Absalom is both of these, just as many other people are today. So after hearing this, he puts Hushai out, and he and his men talk, and they said, you know what? And Absalom agrees with them. Hushai's counsel is better than Ahithophel's. But Hushai doesn't know this. So he is sent away, and he sends to the messengers to tell them, here's what Ahithophel said to do, here's what I said to do. We don't know which way it's going to go, so you tell David he needs to prepare for the worst. He needs to cross over the river. He needs to get out as far away as he can to escape in case Ahithophel comes after him. Now, the messengers are going to try to go in and out unseen, but a boy sees them. And this boy thinks he's being true and loyal to God, apparently, but he goes and tells Absalom that he saw some messengers or some people talking with Hushai. Absalom's men search for them. You can read the story about how they escape being caught, but eventually they do get word back to David. Now, David is going to reorganize his army at this time, and he is going to place Amasa over the army. He's going to do something that he was wanting to do for a long time, and that is get rid of Joab. You know, Joab sometimes didn't follow the king's commands exactly, although Joab did the things that made the most sense militarily. But Joab also knew some of David's secrets. And so he places Amasa over his army. In chapter 18, he has the army divided up into three parts. Joab over 1/3, Abishai over another third, and Abishai is a brother to Joab, and then 1/3 under Ittai the Gittite. So Joab goes from being commander of everybody to commander of only 1/3 of the army. But I'm sure this bothered Joab, but he accepted the decision of David and the demotion without apparently making a big deal out of it. Now David says, I'm going to lead the people. But the people said, no, you are worth far more to us being king and being safe than going out and risking your life. So they convinced David to not go into battle. Now, still in chapter 18, Absalom goes out to do battle. He doesn't have that huge army that he had seen in his mind, and the battle goes against them. We're told that this battle was fought in a forest, and the writer of 2 Samuel said that the forest devoured more people than the sword did. We don't know if that means on both sides or if that means mostly on Absalom's men's side, but regardless, there are more people that are going to fall victim to what's going on in the forest than are going to be killed by each other. During this time, apparently Absalom gets separated from some of his men, and he sees some of David's army coming towards him. He tries to flee. He's riding a mule, and the mule goes under a large oak tree, and Absalom's hair gets caught in the branches, and the mule runs away from him. The man saw this and saw Absalom suspended between the heaven and the earth, hanging in the tree by his hair, and he couldn't get loose. And he went back and told Joab what he had seen. And Joab said, why didn't you kill him? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a new belt. Well, the man said, no, no, no. I heard your father tell you and the rest of the army to be careful and protect his son. I wouldn't have done what you asked for 1,000 pieces of silver. He said, because if I had and the king heard of it and I got into trouble, you would have put distance between yourself and me. You would have stood aloof. Well, Joab knew what he was saying was true, but Joab says, I'm tired of talking to you. And Joab takes 3 spears and he goes out and he finds Absalom still alive in the tree. He thrusts the 3 spears into Absalom's heart, killing him, and then he gets ready to take word back to the king. Now, after the death of Absalom, the battle is pretty much over. Ahimaaz, who is the son of Zadok, one of the messengers, asked for permission to take the news about this back to David. Joab said, no, I'm sending the Cushites. And Ahimaaz knows that this message is going to come as a shock to David, and apparently he's overheard the message, and he wants to soften the blow to David, so he says again, I want to take the message. I'm going to take the message. And Joab said, why? You're not going to be paid. But Ahimaaz runs anyway, and he runs in a way so fast that he outruns the Cushite, and he gets to David before the Cushite does. Now, when Ahimaaz gets to David, David sees him coming. He says, he's a good man. He comes with good news. And he asks David, or David asks him about what's going on. And Ahimaaz says, there was a great tumult. I saw that, but I don't know what it was. So the king knows something big happened. Then the Cushite gets there, and the king asks, how are things? And he said, your son Absalom is dead. David now goes immediately into mourning over his son Absalom's death. In chapter 19, the word gets out to the rest of the army that David is weeping over Absalom's death. Now Joab goes to David, and he criticized him. He said, you've turned a victory into a defeat. These men have gone into battle. They've risked their lives for you, and you make it seem like you would have been happier if they had died and Absalom had lived. If you do not go out and speak to these people, then what's going to happen next is worse than anything that has happened to you since you were a youth. And David knows that Joab is right. So for the time, he sets aside his grief. He goes out to the people. He speaks kind words to them. Basically, he expresses his gratitude to them for their work and for their sacrifice. And they go home to their places. And David avoids the people turning away from him. Now, we've covered a lot of material in this time period, and I hope that you've read through this, and because if you have, then all of this makes better sense. But there's some very important lessons that we can gain from this that we can take with us today. This is not just a little history story. This is something that's meant to benefit us. First of all, we learn something about friendship. You know, you learn who your real friends are when you are in hard times. David's going to learn who his real friends are. And they're going to know, he's going to know exactly who he can trust. But there's also another side to this. When you have someone else that's a friend of yours and they are in trouble, you can be that kind of friend for them. There's a second lesson, and that's about trusting God. Things were terrible for David. David had to leave town so quickly. He couldn't take things with him. He had to leave the throne behind. He did not know how things were going to turn out. And then things got worse. There's an old joke told by a comedian that said, I was really feeling bad, and someone told me, cheer up, things could be worse. So I cheered up, and sure enough, things got worse. Well, in this case, things got worse when David learned about Ahithophel. When he found out that Ahithophel was counseling Absalom, he prayed to God. If you and I have troubles, no matter how bad they are, we need to trust God and pray to Him, and He will send help to you just as He did with David. Number 3, we learned something about humility and patience. You know, when Shimei was rejoicing over David's problems, David acted in a very humble way. And when others said, you need to take off his head, you need to punish him, David showed a lot of humility and patience as well. And basically, he turned his problems over to God. Later on, you can read that God did take care of Shimei through David's son Solomon. He did not escape the punishment he deserved. But David was patient. Now is not the time to be doing things like this. And you and I sometimes get in a hurry when things are bad. We're thinking about ourselves, and we need to follow David's example. Be humble, and then wait. And number 4, there are some times when you just need to surrender. No matter how convinced you are that you need to be out in front, you need to be the one doing things, you need to listen to others. David surrendered to the advice of other people when they said, you don't need to be the one who goes out and leads the army. And David could have been proud. He could have said, hey, listen now, I'm the king. I make that decision. But he surrendered to their will. And you and I sometimes have to listen to people. There was a time in Abraham's life when Sarah counseled him something that he did not like at all. And God told him, you need to listen to your wife, Sarah. And if you're married, you've probably found that there are a lot of times when you need to listen to your spouse. And when you do, it will probably turn out very well, and you'll help the relationship. And David, I think, helped the relationship between him and his people by listening to them. Number 5, acceptance. Things didn't turn out the way David had hoped. He wanted to keep the throne, but he also did not want his son Absalom harmed or killed. And there are times in our lives when we would like to save our loved ones from themselves, but we can't always do it. It's not within our power to make everything turn out perfectly. And sometimes we just have to accept that. And then one last thing, we learn about appreciation. David was so caught up in his own grief, he forgot to show appreciation to those around him. You know, you and I need to show true thankfulness for those who have sacrificed to help us. Even when things didn't turn out the way we wanted them to turn out, there are people helping us all the time. And some of them go to great lengths to help us. And we need to always remember to take note of that, to let them know we saw that, we realized what they did, and we appreciate so much what they did. It will go a long way in helping you in the eyesight and the view of other people. Well, that's our lesson for tonight. There is something that's been missing from these lessons, and my wife pointed this out to me the other day, and I said, you know, you're right. She said, after your lessons, what do you usually do? And I said, well, we have everybody come into the auditorium, we sing some songs, we have a prayer, we have a devotional. She said, you know what, we need a devotional. So here's a very short one. And it's one I think that we all need at this particular time in our lives and in our nation's history. We have a situation where we're having to stay at home. People are having to stay away from their jobs, not even of their own choice. People are losing money. Kids, I feel sorry for so many of the kids. A lot of them have worked hard on different things that they cannot enjoy the fruits of their labors now. Athletes trained very hard and are told, you're not going to have a season this year. You're not going to get to play any games. Some of them are seniors, and they were wanting to go out on a high note, and some of them were in playoffs, and that was all stopped. Well, you have my sympathies. You also have my admiration, because you are having to endure something that most of us never had to even think about enduring. And the ones that are graduating, you're not going to be able to stand together with your friends and graduate. And there might be a temptation for all of us to step back and say, why me? God, why did you do this to me? Why did this have to happen at this time? Because I had so many things that I wanted to do and I can't do. Well, if you have that temptation, I want to tell you about somebody. It's a person that, if you're my age, you probably remember very well. If you're not my age, if you're too young to have this name sound familiar, you need to Google it, okay? There was a tennis player named Arthur Ashe. He spelled his last name A-S-H-E. And Arthur Ashe was a marvelous tennis player, very successful, gifted athlete. And he was one who won the Wimbledon championship. But in 1983, Arthur Ashe had to have heart surgery. And when he was having heart surgery, he received some infected blood. This was infected with the AIDS virus. And not much was known about AIDS at that time, and they did not know that it was so prevalent that it was in the blood supply. So Arthur Ashe contracted AIDS, and he eventually died from complications caused by AIDS. Now, one of the many letters that he got from his fans during this time asked him a question. Why did God have to select you for such a bad disease? Now, I want you to hear Arthur Ashe's response. He said, 50 million children started playing tennis. Only 5 million really learned how to play tennis. Only 500,000 learned to get into professional tennis. Only 50,000 were on the tennis circuit. Only 5,000 reached the Grand Slam. 50 reached Wimbledon. 4 reached the semifinals. 2 reached the finals. And he said, when I held the Wimbledon Cup in my hand, I didn't ask God, why me? So now that I'm in pain, why should I ask God, why me? This is a hard time. This is an unprecedented tragedy and challenge that faces the entire world. But remember, we've had a lot of good things happen. There are a lot of good things happening even now. And there were so many good things that have happened in our lives in times past. We never asked God, why me? We felt like somehow we deserved that, but we don't deserve bad things, right? Wrong. So don't ask God, why me during the hard times. You didn't ask God, why me during the good times. But just realize that God is still there. God is still in control, no matter what others might think. And God will bring us through all of this. May God bless you until we get to see each other again.